Good evening and welcome to Wawa CU, the virtual 2021 edition. This is just very delighted, actually just tickled, I would say, possibly tickled to have David Horgan, my cousin-in-law for these many years. We're trying to remember the first time I met David was when David and Beth were living in, what's the name of that little town?
Grantsdale.
Grantsdale. Must have been 1970 something. And yeah, Viv and I.
What state?
I was in Montana, the big sky country. And Viv and I drove out in her little Volkswagen Beetle.
Oh.
Crossed the dread Bozeman Pass with chains on her little Volkswagen Beetle and made it out there. So anyway, but enough of these reminiscences.
What month was that?
That was it was the fall.
And he needed chains. Wow. These many years, no pun intended.
Yes. And David, I've just known you to be just an awesome fellow, a great musician, always interested in life and in music and in just lots of things. And now you've written this book. You've gone and written a dang book, which I think is totally like just a whole nother dimension to who you are. So that's why I'm just really excited to have you in this Wawa CU session for Family Camp. This is very fitting with the kind of work we've been doing this week with all of our elders to just understand their lives and their stories of, the old country and then coming to America and that kind of thing. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David. And if you need me to show anything, just let me know. Actually, let's pop up I'll show the cover of the book, which is will be available. Are you seeing the?
Oh, that's pretty.
Yeah.
It comes
David,
out.
when is the book?
It comes out August 17th, so a little under a month from now is the publication date.
Yep. And we advise asking your local independent bookstore to order it.
Yeah, it's coming out from the University of Nevada Press, which is a regional press that's been in operation since 1961. So they've been going a long time, but they're not huge. They do have it. There's a presence on Amazon already, and it can be pre-ordered there. But I do encourage anybody who has a local bookstore that they like to support your local bookstore if they can get it.
Will it be available as an ebook?
Yes. Yes.
Really?
Amazon for sure has the ebook also pre-orderable, I am told.
Yeah,
I love the cover art. Is that is that a relative of yours? Is that your mother? Is that a real photo?
This is a photo of my mother.
Wow.
I was just telling Alan about it. This is November 1946. She had just arrived in the United States, and a stranger took this photo of her on the street.
Oh.
And then got her address. She was living at the Salvation Army Hotel for Women in San Francisco called the Evangeline. And he left this photo for her. It's a black and white photo. The publisher decided to do this tinting effect, which I actually like a lot. And they made this choice about the cover. I had nothing to do with it other than sending them the photo. The photo also appears in the book in its black and white regular form, but they liked this photo, and I think it was a really good decision. It's actually the exact midpoint of her life, in a sense. She finally had made it to the United States from the Far East where she grew up, and her life was about to change.
She looks beautiful.
Yeah, she does. The book is going to have a number of photos of her across the decades, and she was never shy about the camera. There's kind of a disdainful gaze as she's wondering who the heck is flashing this camera in front of her face. But yeah, she was a friend of the camera, for sure. So before I go any farther, I just really want to thank Alan particularly, but everybody involved with Family Camp for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor. I'm deeply honored, actually. I know some of you, but some of you I don't. And it's very much a treat for me. This is absolutely my first semi-public event associated with the book. And I'm really excited about it. And this seems like a great place to do a little launch event. So I guess I could tell you a bit more about it. And then if you like, I could read a little if people would like to hear a little.
Yes.
But I'm open to all kinds of suggestions. And I hope that somehow we will get into some discussion and some questions. I don't pretend to be an absolute expert on the early first half of the 20th century in the Far East. My research was only in regard to my mother and grandmother's particular stories, which involved the city of Harbin in Manchuria, what was called Manchuria, Shanghai, and then the war years in Kobe, Japan. So what this book is really a combination of a biography, mainly of my mother, but also of my grandmother, because their lives were very closely entwined, and a memoir from my point of view, growing up under the wings of these strong women in the city of Reno, Nevada, where they ended up living out the remainder of their lives shortly after World War II. So my grandmother came, they were Russian Jews. My grandmother was born in Odessa in what is now Ukraine. Ah, indeed. Thank you, Alan.
Here's the map.
So Odessa is way over there on the left side. Of course, it's on the Black Sea. And she was born in 1896, and this was the Russian Empire still under the Tsar. And the Jews were being severely persecuted, as they had been for centuries, really. And there was a wave of persecutions going on for somewhat seemingly complicated reasons, but sometimes it seems sort of depressingly simple because it just happened over and over again. They were the scapegoats whenever there was trouble in many parts of that part of the world. The Jewish people were the scapegoats and were persecuted. So a wave of Jews decided to migrate eastward into China. And that city on the far right it's called Harbin. And it's all the way over, it's in northeastern China. And that was a very interesting place. It was a city that was really established by the Russians because the Chinese had allowed the Russians to finish building the Trans-Siberian Railroad across Manchuria to connect the Russian Empire with its ports all the way over, ports like Vladivostok on the China Sea. And the ministers under the Tsar had this brilliant idea. Gee, let's send a lot of Jews out there. They can take their money and their families and they'll populate this area, and that'll help us gain an economic foothold. And it was actually quite successful. And my grandmother's family was part of that exodus. And so from the age of 9, approximately, my grandmother grew up in a very, very Russian community, but within Chinese territory. And then she grew up. She how do I put it? She was kind of a flapper. She was a 20s flapper, and we gathered later a pretty lively young lady.
Yes. I pay for this, correct? Yes.
She ran off with a gentleman from Finland, and he was either a Russian or a Finn, we're not sure. And she ran off to Japan with him, where he had business. And they had this child born, and this was my mother. My mother was born in Japan of Russian and Finnish parents. And then it's complicated, but the grandmother ended up back in China as a single mother without, my mother's father died very early on, and she had to raise her daughter in very difficult circumstances back in China. And they traveled southward to Shanghai, which was, at least in theory, a better place to raise her child. And my mother was raised in Shanghai. And then, to leap across time a little bit, they ended up in Japan.
Sorry, David, I'm trying to catch up on the pictures. So this is.
Oh yeah, this is the only photograph of the 3 of them. That's my grandmother. That's my mother as a baby, and that's Mr. Edward Koskin, who died around 1925 and was completely gone from the picture. So this photo undoubtedly was in Kobe, in Japan, shortly after my mother's birth.
Was he older than Rachel?
By quite a bit.
Yeah, he looks older.
And supposedly he had a heart attack. He died of a heart attack while hiking in the hills in Kobe. When my grandmother was back, she had taken her 2-year-old daughter to visit the family that was back in Harbin in China. And while there, she received word that Mr. Koskin, whom she had never actually married, had died. And she was basically stranded with her daughter and had to figure out how to raise her daughter. So that's the bones of the first half of the story. And the second half of the book becomes a memoir from my point of view once they made it to the United States. And my mother had met this man from Reno, Nevada, and married him and moved there and spent the rest of her life. And the second half of the book is really my own memoir of what it was like to grow up in this unusual family. My father was a devout Catholic, and my mother was a non-believing Jew, but she had to promise to raise us as good little Catholics and send us to Catholic school, which she didn't mind at all because she loved the discipline inflicted upon us by the nuns.
So did your mom grow up in the expat community, or did she grow up being influenced, was she fluent in Chinese? How much of the Chinese environment did she pick up in Shanghai?
Not very much. I think they were typical of foreigners of all economic strata in places like Shanghai. So they certainly did not learn to speak Chinese because they didn't have to. The Chinese accommodated the foreigners, with their pidgin language that they created, which made it easy for the foreigners to communicate with them. And I think it was true for the super wealthy people who lived in the French concession of Shanghai, and it was equally true of the Russians, of the poorer Russians and poorer immigrants who lived in some of the far less glamorous neighborhoods.
I popped up the map of Shanghai.
Yeah, that's a map of central Shanghai, 1937. And you see Helmi and Rochelle was my grandmother. Helmi and Rochelle's home is up there on the upper right. And that neighborhood was part of what was called the International Settlement, which was jointly controlled really by the British and the Americans. And the surrounding districts, which are not very much even on this map, or were because the Chinese inhabitants lived all through these neighborhoods also. The French concession down more in the center was really the wealthiest district, although parts of the International Settlement were also pretty wealthy districts. All that dark black area is very approximately the areas destroyed by the Japanese attacks, mostly in 1937 when they really bombed and attacked, and there was serious street war in Shanghai.
Does that mean that your mom's home was bombed or destroyed? Because it looks like it's in the black area.
Yes, it was. They lost the entire block, I believe. And their corner, my friend Kirk made this map, and where he put that little circle it's pretty accurate. There's a corner right there, which we found when we visited there. And in fact, as late as 2013, that block had not been rebuilt. It was basically a big parking lot. There was a gate post there.
That picture of you on that gate post?
Yeah.
Is that, wrong, other way.
No,
wrong.
Yeah,
where is it?
Right,
Where is it? Where is it? Right, hang on, let me look.
It would be back in the Shanghai. Well, no, because the book jumps around the timeline. So
there, found it.
You did?
Yep.
Yeah. So that photo on the left, thanks, Alan.
Yep.
That photo on the left is my mother, my stepfather. So my father actually died in 1966. My mother remarried in 1968. And her second husband was fascinated by her story and pressed her for years to go back. He wanted her to go back and show her where she lived. She resisted him for a long, long time. Finally, in 1987, she gave in, mainly just to get him to lay off of it. She didn't want to go. But she went, and she stood in front of this gate post. Behind her right shoulder, behind that gate, is a big parking lot where her building must have stood. And I'm not sure if this gate post was connected to the building. It's really hard to tell from old photographs, but in any case, on the right there is the first time we visited Shanghai in 2008. And lo and behold, it's the same, very much the same gate and the same gate post. We were looking at all four corners, and finally, I'm thinking maybe it was Vivan who spotted this gate post and said, "Gosh, that's it." And
so you didn't go on the trip with your mom and your stepfather?
No, our son Ty was born that same year, 1987. So we were busy. Beth and I were busy with our little baby. I really had wished that I could go. And my stepfather kept a good diary, and including that photo, he made an album with a lot of great information. That entire album, though, was lost for many years, and it wasn't until after my mother had died and my stepfather had died, and suddenly that album appeared in the bottom of a box. It was one of the details that showed up on my doorstep that really allowed me to proceed and fill in a lot of the gaps of this story. All we had to go on were stories from my mother and grandmother that were not connected with enough actual facts and detail. I had to do a lot of digging and research and I located some relatives and some old friends of theirs from Japan, some relatives from the China years, and I was able to fill in enough to be able to tell the story.
How did your mother survive in Shanghai, and what made her decide to come to the US?
She was asked that question many times. How did you survive? And she had this stock answer. She'd look you in the eye and she'd say, with great difficulty. And that usually shut people up. They would go, oh. And what it really meant was, so they were lucky in one sense. My grandmother had grown up in Harbin. She'd been able to go to school. She'd been able to study English. She spoke quite good English. And she raised my mother. My mother always said that from her earliest memories, her mother had insisted on speaking English to her, even though the rest of the family mostly spoke Russian and some Yiddish, but mostly Russian. My grandmother was really big on English and was able to send my mother to a British-run school in Shanghai. It turns out she was absolutely right. Speaking English was the critical skill to have. They were able to rent a tenement building in Shanghai, just north of the Huangpu River there, from an American realty company, and sublet most of the other rooms and make enough to survive. And my grandmother and her older sister did that together because they could speak English and they could communicate with the American powers that controlled a lot of those neighborhoods. And they built these cold water tenements. These were places where there was no hot water. And in fact, you really they had to go down and buy their water on the street and then come up and boil it, probably on these charcoal furnaces. It's the same way that a lot of the Chinese people live. And they had for plumbing, for bathroom facility, they just had buckets that were picked up every morning by these Chinese people with their carriages. And they were called honey buckets. And that's the way a lot of the neighborhoods lived, except for the wealthier neighborhood south of the river. And that's the way that my mother grew up. Very much, it was very, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, I know there was still tremendous contrast. Many of the Chinese residents of Shanghai lived even poorer than that. And there were people who lived on rafts in the river or lived on the street in absolutely terrible conditions with no roof over their heads. At least these people, some of these Russians, had a roof over their heads, but they had not much better than that, if I understand it right.
During World War II, after the Japanese took over China,
yes,
and of course they were allies of the Germans, did being Jewish have any risks, or were the Jews pretty much left in safety?
That's a very interesting question. And my mother had always said that they were left very much alone, even living in Japan. But in fact, they were quite lucky. Late in the war, around 1943, probably late 1943, the Japanese, at the behest of the Germans, did in fact give in and establish a quasi-ghetto. They referred to it as just a designated area, and it was in Shanghai. And they relocated a lot of Jewish people to this designated area in Shanghai, which in fact was exactly the neighborhood where my mother had lived, my grandmother had lived, on that neighborhood where their block was bombed and destroyed. And many of those Jews, beginning about late 1938 through 1941, into 1941 maybe, there was a tremendous influx of Jews from Europe who were desperately escaping the Nazis if they possibly could. And one of the places some of them were able to escape to was Shanghai. And partly because Shanghai had been this treaty port for decades, which meant essentially that if you could get there and get off the boat on the dock, nobody asked you any questions. Nobody asked you for papers. You could walk right into the city and be there.
Right.
And so that a really substantial number of Jews, probably as many as 20,000, did arrive in the middle of the war. Now, at this point, my mother and grandmother were already in Japan.
Oh.
They'd gone to Japan by 1939.
Okay.
Strangely enough. And even some of the recently arrived Jews who even had managed to escape into Japan were sent back to Shanghai and were quarantined in this semi-ghetto neighborhood. But some of them were left alone if they could show that they'd been established in Japan earlier. And since my grandmother had lived there earlier and my mother had been born in Japan, they were among the very few who were left alone by the Japanese. Then once they were, from what I understand, and there's quite a number of memoirs written by some of these Jews who were confined to that designated area in Shanghai. And they lived in cramped quarters and they were restricted in their movements, but they were not at all persecuted the way the Jews were persecuted and murdered, obviously, in Europe. There seemed to be, from what I've read up, there seemed to be this belief among the Japanese hierarchy that once they had won the war and established their new empire, they were going to need the Jews on their side or something like that. They definitely resisted the German exhortations to round up their Jews. And it's strange to ponder in a way because the Japanese, of course, were absolutely brutal to the Chinese, whom they were horrible.
Right.
The Japanese treated the Chinese the way the Germans treated the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. But they weren't interested in chasing the Jews. And luckily for a very small number of people who managed to make it to that, of Jewish people who managed to make it there.
So what made your mother and grandmother decide to go to Japan in the middle of the war like that?
Well, here's what I believe, and this is the way I tell the story because I believe it's true. My grandmother was a very high-strung person, and I think she created some difficulty within the family just because of her personality. That's something I gathered finally by tracking down some relatives and pinning them down a little bit. And we knew, growing up, we were aware of her as being very high strung. To us, she was a comical little old Russian lady. But she was, I think in her younger years, she was also savvy. She didn't like what was happening in Shanghai. It had been happening up in Harbin where her parents had lived. Her parents had to also come down to Shanghai from Harbin. The Japanese were making life difficult for everybody, particularly the Chinese, of course. But since my grandmother had, in the 20s, she had established some kind of life for herself in Japan, although it was totally interrupted when this gentleman that she had her child with had died and disappeared. She saw an opportunity, maybe, for a slightly better life and decided to go to Japan. And there was a brief period where my mother wanted to finish high school in Shanghai where she was going to school. And my grandmother let her stay. She had to stay with relatives because they didn't have a home anymore. And they actually had these rich relatives in the French concession who had ignored them for years. And my mother got to live on the attic of this mansion as long as she stayed out of the way, because apparently the lady of the house, who was my mother's great aunt, was living she was married to an American and living the kind of life where she was pretending to not be Jewish. And so they were hiding the old lady, who was her mother, in the attic. And my mother stayed in the attic with this old lady. It's kind of a Gothic sideline to this story. But my mother did get to finish high school in Shanghai. She finished high school at age 16. And then she actually had a scholarship offer to come to the United States, to go to Mills College in the United States. But by now it's 1939. Things were very dicey. And she decided it was better to join her mother in Japan, that going to the United States was too frightening for her. She didn't want to leave her mother behind, was really the main reason. They didn't know that World War II was going to launch as soon as it did. But they did. They were in Japan they were both in Japan by late 1939. My mother actually went to work for a British-owned travel agency because her language skills were so good. And she was working for the British-owned travel agency on the day that the war started. She arrived at work and there was a Japanese soldier standing outside the British travel agency who told her it was closed and that she should go home because they had just arrested all the British travel agents. Huh. And she was allowed to go home because she was stateless. She and my grandmother were technically stateless. They did not have citizenship, which gave them a slight advantage during the war years. They were not interned or arrested because they weren't citizens of any state at war.
Wow.
So they, there was good luck and there was bad luck, because now it's World War II and they're in Japan. And it became difficult even to get enough to eat. They didn't have heating oil. And by 1945, the Americans, who had retaken a lot of the islands coming across the Pacific, had a big air base in Guam, and they started to bomb the absolute hell out of the Japanese cities.
Yep.
I'm showing the picture of Kobe.
Yeah, that's another map my friend made. So that's essentially the harbor and central area of Kobe, and the striped area is all the area that was mostly destroyed by American air raids.
Oh God.
And there you can see up, and it's very hilly. I mean, almost immediately from the harbor area, it rises up to those Rucko Mountains. They were up near the top, again, living in a boarding house that my grandmother rented and sublet the other units. And they always described that when the sky, they would hear this rumbling and the sky would fill with planes and turn absolutely black, because as many as 450 B-29s flying in formation would come in at very low altitude, around 3,000 feet, and drop thousands and thousands of bombs to try to start the whole city on fire, which they successfully did. They were very successful in doing it in Tokyo and some of the other cities. And Kobe was steeper than Tokyo. It made it a little more difficult, but their home apparently survived. The house next door was bombed. And this is a shot of downtown Kobe sometime in late, and probably by the summer of 1945, after probably 4 of these air raids. This is what the city looked like.
Oh.
But there, this is probably the hill where they lived would be behind us as we're looking at this image. This is looking toward the harbor, and as he went up the hill, there would be slightly less damage. And amazingly enough, their home survived. And my little high-strung grandmother actually took in a lot of people and really helped save a number of lives. And I actually met some of the people whose lives were saved by her taking them in, and which gave me a completely new perspective on my crazy little grandmother.
So she did the same thing in Shanghai and Kobe, that she had a building that she was able to rent rooms out of?
Yes, that's right. That was how she survived. Although in Kobe, my mother had gone to work after high school. My mother had gone to work initially for this travel agency and helped bring in income. And then during the war years, they were dependent on this. There was a tiny group of Jews in similar circumstances, and they banded together, and they actually formed an organization that it's a complicated story, but the organization had existed prior to the war. They had set up this organization to help European Jews come through the Far East. And as I said, a lot of them went to Shanghai, but a few people made it all the way across to Japan. And this organization of Jewish people, even in Japan, using money, they were actually getting money from the United States, from Jewish organizations in the United States. Jews in the United States were desperate to help Jews elsewhere in the world, wherever they could find them, wherever they could get their help through. And certainly by the middle of the war, they couldn't get anything through much to Europe. But some money, strangely enough, the Japanese government even allowed the Jewish organization in the United States to send some money to the tiny Jewish organization in Japan, as long as it was being used just for the survival and care of some of the Jews living in their territory. And I think it somehow relates to this notion they had that they were going to want these smart Jewish people working for them when all was said and done. As well as I can understand it, there seemed to be some kind of rationale like that.
About 15 years ago, Frank and I went to Israel, and tour guides who was born and raised in Israel told a story about her grandmother who was born a Jew, Jewish in Europe, fleeing Hitler, and how they knew that the only country in the world that would not require papers that they couldn't get was China.
Yeah.
And China was, there's the infamous story about that ship that came to the United States, that sailed around. Nobody would take them in. They ended up going back to Europe, and all those people ended up in the concentration camp.
That's right.
Well, they knew that China was the only country that would let them in. So she said her grandparents fled via Russia to China, spent World War II there. And then she has this interesting story that they came on a ship to either Canada or the United States after the war. And she thought her grandmother was really weird because she would wear the same blouse day after day. It took about a month on the boat. She would never let this blouse get washed. And she thought her grandmother was really weird. And then when they got to where they were going, it turned out that her grandmother had sewn a diamond into every button as buttons, covered it with cloth, and that every button on her blouse was a diamond.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
There are many stories like that from the European Jews who made it, particularly to Shanghai. And it is remarkable that so many people survived that way. And there's some really wonderful memoirs of those. And actually, my mother had her own stories during the time she was working for the British Travel Agency. This would be probably mostly in 1940, 39, and probably 40 and early 41, before the Japanese actually bombed Pearl Harbor and everything shut down. People were coming through, and her language skills were very useful. She was translating, because she could speak French, she could speak German, she could speak Russian, she could speak Yiddish to Jews. People were arriving in Japan who had come through China, and they were having to pretend to be family groups who were obviously not family groups. And then they were passing through and trying to get to South America or Canada, as you said, anywhere else they could go, or in some cases, that's as far as they got. They were stuck either in China or Japan and had to stay there. People were desperate, and other people were trying to help them as much as they could. But those were places they could land if they could get there. Now, the biggest problem was getting there.
Hey, David, we're about quarter to the hour. So is there a piece of the book? I know, it's just flown by. Did you want to read a piece of the book? Or, I mean, this is kind of a break time, but we can keep on going for a little bit.
I guess I have to apologize for blabbing on so long and not allowing other people to chime in with questions if they want to. But I could, whatever you like. I could read a little if you like.
If there's a piece of the book that you'd like to read, I think that'd be really nice.
All right. Maybe I'll read a little of the prologue, which actually, it's an August day in 1945 in Kobe, Japan. Okay. I have it up here. I can look this direction. On a sweltering summer day, just before noon, a petite young woman sat in a crowded streetcar that rolled along the industrial waterfront of Kobe, Japan's main international seaport. The streetcar's progress was painfully slow. Mounds of rubble were heaped all around, the result of recent American carpet bombings that had killed thousands of people and destroyed large swaths of the city. Entire blocks down near the harbor had been leveled, and to the young woman it seemed miraculous that the streetcar could even still operate. Her hair was dark, nearly black, and although Kobe was the city of her birth, she was not Japanese. Her name was Helmi Koskin, and she was Russian Jewish, part of a small community of foreigners who had survived in Japan throughout the Second World War. She was on her way to one of the waterfront black markets where fresh fruits and vegetables, though officially unavailable, might yet be for sale. She and her mother, with whom she lived in a small boarding house that her mother managed, had subsisted mostly on rations of moldy white rice and beans for the past 4 years of war. Suddenly, the streetcar lurched to a stop in the middle of the block, and the conductor gestured impatiently for everyone to get off. Helmi joined the other passengers filing into the street. It was probably just a blockage on the tracks. No one moved with any particular urgency. Weariness and resignation were in every face. Sirens had sounded several times in recent days, but no American bombers had appeared over Kobe for over a month. Everyone understood that Japan was on its knees. Tokyo, the capital city, had been ravaged repeatedly by fire bombings, as had most of the other major cities. Word was circulating that a week ago, some kind of new bomb, one bomb dropped from a single plane, had obliterated the city of Hiroshima, only 150 miles to the east. Another, 3 days later, supposedly had done the same to Nagasaki, a bit further away. In between these horrors, the Soviet Union, fresh from fighting the Nazis, finally declared war on Japan. Would Russians soon be dropping bombs too? No one knew what to believe anymore. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Helmi looked upward at the hazy sky, wondering if it was Kobe's fate also to be wiped off the map. But there was nothing in the sky and no sound of a plane. Traffic all around had stopped, and people had congregated on the sidewalk, maintaining an odd silence. Some were gathered around a table set outside a storefront on which a large console radio had been placed. The radio suddenly crackled to life, as did the loudspeakers mounted on rickety poles that normally broadcast air raid sirens. There were no sirens now, just the crackling static, but everyone around her appeared intent on listening. Then a voice began broadcasting, tinny and peculiarly high-pitched. She strained to listen, but she could understand nothing. She had lived in Kobe long enough to learn conversational Japanese, but this voice spoke in an unfamiliar dialect. She couldn't even tell whether it was a man's voice or a woman's. People glanced at each other with shocked expressions, but no one looked at her. The voice from the speakers went on for several minutes and then abruptly stopped, and all was quiet again. For a few seconds, nothing happened and no one moved, as if the world had been frozen. Then, slowly, people shuffled to life again on the sidewalks. Cars and trucks and bicycles started moving up the street, and passengers made their way back to the streetcar. Faces remained stunned. Hardly anyone spoke. A few had begun to weep. She overheard a word spoken in a whisper, Showa. This is what they called their emperor. Was the voice his? What in the world could he have to say? As far as she knew, he had never before addressed the populace. Had he announced some new restrictions? Would there be the great invasion of the mainland that many had feared? It wasn't until later, when she finally returned home with a few meager vegetables, that she learned the news from an English-speaking Japanese neighbor. Indeed, it was the emperor, speaking directly to his people for the first time in his life. His speech had a title, The Jewel Voice Broadcast, and it had been delivered in the arcane dialect used for rare royal decrees. The message was simple. Japan had surrendered to America. Helmi Koskin was 22 years old in 1945. She saw that everything now would change. It would be a different world. Whether better or worse, she couldn't tell, although it was hard to imagine things getting much worse. She had long hoped for her life to be different. She had hoped to live in a place where she could feel she belonged. Her first languages were Russian and English, yet she had never lived in a place where either of these was the native tongue. Although her birthplace was Japan, her mother had raised her in Shanghai, across the South China Sea, under impoverished conditions. The Japanese had bombed their tenement there during the invasion of China, before the Second World War even began. After fleeing back to Japan, they had endured more privation and more bombs. Their house was one of the few on their block still standing. They had no citizenship anywhere. They had no true home. Throughout the war, the Japanese had relentlessly publicized the idea that Americans were vicious barbarians, and that if war ever came to the mainland, people would be slaughtered mercilessly, tortured, even eaten alive. Helmi Koskin never believed this. For as long as she could remember, she had harbored an image of America gleaned from books and movies and music and from a few actual Americans she had met. If America would stop raining down bombs, then she believed in her heart that things would get better. If the war was really over, then maybe she could finally find a place to call home.
Wow.
That's great.
That's amazing.
David,
That's amazing.
Wow.
Thank you so much, David.
That's just amazing.
Awesome. Oh, thanks.
Very,
Thank
very,
you, David.
very
Thank you,
eloquent, David. Very
Yes.
eloquent.
Wow.
Yep.
So, and it goes on. I decided to do a lot of backstory. I tell my grandmother's story as much as I could, and I fill in some enough history so that people can understand the context. But I tried to keep it a very personal story as I went along. It was a little bit of a juggling act.
So did you interview your mother a lot for this?
Luckily, not a lot, not enough, but just enough. My brother and I, some of it's even on videotape, late in her life, including just about a year and a half before she died. She died of a stroke rather suddenly at age 78. But yes, on several occasions, and luckily, and I took good notes and we recorded some of it. And that really was that's the backbone of the story. Without her telling me all these details in interviews, I would have had to, write a novel and make it all up. As it is, it's as true as I could make it.
Wow.
David, thank you so much. This has been just a fascinating hour.
Really.
I just want to thank you for your time,
Fantastic.
for your research and your writing, your diligence. I went to China with you and we did some of that exploration and stuff, and just your dedication to this project has been amazing.
Well, I want to say I'm just honored to be able to just do this small presentation for all of you, and I have such respect for the Lowe family, certainly, and the Yang family, and everybody that I've met connected with all of you. I feel honored to be a shirt-tail Chinese relative.
Honorary Chinese, David, honorary. So thank you so much, David. Just a big round of applause for David. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to take a short break and then we'll actually going to stop the recording.